The hidden legacies of an ancient prophecy. Imagine the hush of a candlelit chamber deep within the corridors of a 1,000-year-old monastery, where the air is thick with the scent of incense and the echo of chanting voices. In this tranquil space, a humble Zen master named Hango Xiun once recorded verses that would ripple across the centuries, shaping the stories of dynasties and the fate of civilizations. This ancient figure, often overshadowed in modern discussions by well-known prophets like Nostradamus, nonetheless cast his own formidable shadow through 14 cryptic poems, his words penned in an era of imperial splendor and turmoil, reach beyond their immediate audience to speak to times far removed from his own. His legacy remained relatively obscure for centuries, hidden in collections of classical verse, overshadowed by the vast tapestry of Chinese literature and forgotten during periods of political upheaval. Yet in the contemporary world where technology has brought new powers of discovery, translations of these near-lost texts have emerged, and historians have been stunned by their uncanny accuracy. According to local legends, Hango Xiun was regarded as one of the 7 greatest seers in the history of ancient China. He lived during the Tang dynasty, an era renowned for its cultural flourishing and vibrant expression of Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism. Despite his revered status, Hango Xiun did not behave like the archetypal prophets who traveled to town squares preaching salvation. Instead, he was more a solitary figure, devoting himself to meditation and the pursuit of inner enlightenment. He favored silence over spectacle, preferring that his revelations be recorded quietly on scrolls rather than proclaimed from rooftops. Ironically, it was exactly this understated approach that allowed his words to endure through a millennium of dynastic changes. One particularly striking event in Hango Xiun's life was his run-in with the future Emperor Xuanzong of the Tang, whom he famously admonished with a swift slap. To an ordinary observer, it might have seemed an act of brazen disrespect, but within the context of Zen practice, it was a profound teaching tool. The shock of being struck was intended to jolt the young ruler out of complacency, reminding him that power was fleeting and that true wisdom demanded deep humility. Far from punishing the monk, the future emperor recognized the sincerity behind this lesson. He would later reward Hango Xiun with an honorary title, the Rude Monk, a moniker mixing light humor with deep reverence. This imperial favor led to the official transcription of Hango Xiun's teachings, prophecies, and poems, without which his verses might have been lost to the dark recesses of neglected archives. Over the centuries, those 14 prophetic poems became objects of fascination for scholars and mystics alike. At first, most readers saw them merely as poetic riddles or moral commentaries. Yet as time marched on, significant historical events appeared to align with many of the verses, sparking a resurgence of interest. Before long, people noticed that 12 of those 14 prophecies had seemingly unfolded with eerie precision, pointing toward major turning points in Chinese history. The fall of the Ming, the rise of the Qing, the reign of Kangxi, the golden era of Qianlong, and even the cataclysms that followed. In the realm of modern speculation, the remaining 2 prophecies have stoked particular anxiety, given that one specifically names the year 2025. How was it possible that a monk immersed in silent contemplation could predict events so far beyond his time? This question is what beckons us to explore the enigmatic, profound legacy of Zen Master Hango Xiun. To grasp the full significance of Hango Xiun's prophecies, one must revisit the broader context of Chinese dynastic history and the pivotal transformations that shaped it. The Ming Dynasty, known for its technological innovations and cultural achievements, was the last imperial rule established by the Han Chinese majority. From the construction of the Forbidden City to the voyages of Admiral Zheng He Ming China, displayed a confident splendor that dazzled the world. Yet just as the sun reaches its zenith before commencing its slow descent, the Ming's brilliance foreshadowed a looming twilight. Plagued by internal corruption, natural disasters, and external threats, the dynasty began unraveling in the early 17th century. What astonishes many historians is that Hango Xiun's very first poem outlined symbols corresponding to chaos between the sun and the moon, symbols that happened to feature prominently in the Ming imperial emblem. Disillusionment, famine, and the continuous encroachment of Manchu forces to the north wore away at the Ming's foundations. The final blow came in 1644 when the rebel leader Li Zicheng seized Beijing. Cornered and facing certain doom, Emperor Chongzhen is said to have ended his life beneath a gnarled tree inside the imperial gardens. Historians describe this moment as the final lament of a dynasty that had once inspired confidence across Asia. In studying Hango Xiun's first poem, scholars noticed it was more than a general omen. Its imagery matched both the cosmic turmoil and the specific manner of the Ming's demise. Whether one reads it as allegory or true foresight, the lines depicted an empire whose vitality had been sapped from within, culminating in a swift and tragic downfall. Naturally, with the fall of the Ming came the rise of a new power, the Qing dynasty established by the Manchus. Some might imagine that conquering China would have been a swift affair, but the transition was fraught with resistance, rebellions, and the complexities of bridging different ethnic and cultural identities. Yet once the Qing solidified its rule, it brought about a lengthy era of imperial grandeur. At its height, Qing China became a formidable presence, impressing diplomats and merchants from across the globe. While many in modern times might remember the Qing primarily for its final tragic encounters with Western imperialism, it actually encompassed some of the most stable reigns in Chinese history. In Hango Xiun's poems, the shift from Ming to Qing is less about the specific names of dynasties and more about the rhythm of historical change. Every ascent follows a decline. Emphasizing the cyclical nature of existence, Hango Xiun's verses echo fundamental tenets of both Eastern philosophy and Buddhism itself. Everything that arises will inevitably fade. Though none of Hango Xiun's prophecy-laden poems mention the year 1644 directly, the swirling imagery of upheaval and renewal indicates the meltdown of one colossal order and the dawning of another. These words, written in a time when the future Qing was scarcely an unimaginable threat, carried glimpses of the storms to come. Central to the Qing's lasting legacy is the extraordinary reign of Emperor Kangxi, whose name looms large in both the official histories and the second prophetic poem attributed to Hango Xiun. Kangxi ascended the throne as a child of merely 8 years in 1661, inheriting not just the pomp of imperial authority, but a realm riddled with tension and power struggles. Chief among those who tested the young monarch's resolve was Oboy, one of 4 regents entrusted with guiding the empire until Kangxi reached maturity. Shrewd and ambitious Oboy amassed significant personal power, effectively overshadowing the youthful ruler. By the time Kangxi was in his mid-teens, Oh Boy had become the de facto head of state, his word carrying more weight than imperial edicts. Yet, as if lifted directly from the lines of Hango Xiun's verse, Kangxi demonstrated an uncanny political brilliance far beyond his years. In a meticulously plotted maneuver in 1669, the teenage emperor orchestrated Oh Boy's downfall during a simple palace meeting. The teacup that Oh Boy dropped accidentally or otherwise served as a pretext for a swift arrest by palace guards. Overnight, Kangxi transformed from a figurehead child sovereign into a decisive strategic leader who commanded the respect of his ministers and generals. In Hango Xiun's second poem, there is a cryptic line about a young dragon reclaiming its domain, coupled with a hint at an exceptionally lengthy reign. Intriguingly, Kangxi would rule for 61 years, becoming one of China's longest reigning emperors. This is precisely the figure inscribed in Hango Xiun's prophecy. Kangxi's era was momentous. He subdued external threats, negotiated with powerful neighboring states, and cultivated a flourishing court culture that blended Manchu traditions with classical Chinese ideals. The empire's boundaries expanded literature, and the arts thrived, and scientific endeavors boosted by Jesuit influences became a hallmark of his reign. Some historians even compare Kangxi's court to the Renaissance spheres of Europe for its patronage of arts, sciences, and philosophy. Meanwhile, the prophecy's allusion to a sustained golden era was being realized. However, the poem also carried a subtle warning that even this remarkable rule was transient in the grand scale of eternity. That transience crystallized when Kangxi's life came to an end in 1722. By then he had seen the empire grow powerful and wealthy, but he also understood the seeds of future challenges were already germinating. His passing marked the close of one of the Qing's greatest chapters, yet it did not mark the end of Hango Xiun's uncanny verses. The third poem, which some interpret as a transition bridging Kangxi's reign to the next era, subtly portended further transformations, both of extraordinary splendor and gradual decay. Thus, the second poem about Kangxi dovetails into the subsequent verses, predicting Emperor Yongzheng, Emperor Qianlong, and the swirling tide of fortune that would define the 18th century. In reflecting upon Kangxi's story, we observe the living embodiment of Hango Xiun's principle, that all worldly achievements, no matter how towering, remain subject to the flow of time, culminating inevitably in change. Within the tapestry, woven by Zen Master Hango Xiun's prophetic poems, the figure of Emperor Qianlong stands out, occupying an entire verse dedicated to both his peak achievements and the foreshadowed demise that would follow closely behind. Ascending the throne in 1735, Qianlong enjoyed one of the longest periods of de facto rule in Chinese history. Although he officially abdicated after 60 years, refraining from surpassing his esteemed grandfather, Kangxi's 61-year reign, Qianlong retained power behind the scenes as the Taishang Huang, or retired emperor, until his death in 1799. Thus, the substance of Hango Xiun's fourth poem, predicting a reign spanning 6 decades, was fulfilled in a manner even more exacting than many might have anticipated. Under Qianlong's governance, the empire expanded its frontiers from Xinjiang in the west to Taiwan in the east, while sending diplomatic missions to vassal states and beyond. The arts attained new heights as Qianlong, personally enthralled by poetry and calligraphy, patronized scholars, painters, and artisans. lavish palatial expansions and widespread cultural projects such as the Siku Kwanshu, complete library of the four treasuries, emerged during this period, showcasing the breathtaking opulence of a dynasty at its zenith. Many modern observers cite Qianlong's court as one of the epitomes of imperial extravagance, marked by grand festivals, sumptuous banquets, and monumental architectural ventures. And yet Qianlong's later years were dogged by the emergence of corruption and complacency that paved the way for future crises. The emperor entrusted significant authority to individuals like He Shen, a favored court official who epitomized the lethal intersection of greed and favoritism. Under He Shen's influence, the bureaucracy became riddled with deceit, while Qianlong himself grew more detached from the harsh realities faced by common people. It is in this dichotomy of splendor and decline that historians see the reflection of Hango Xiun's ominous undertones. The poem implied not only a glittering golden age, but also an imminent downfall lurking just beyond its brightness, like a storm gathering at the edge of an otherwise clear sky. Indeed, following Qianlong's death, the empire found itself grappling with internal rebellions like the White Lotus Rebellion and external challenges that hinted at an increasingly industrialized Europe peering at China as a vast market for goods. Before long, the unstoppable tide of Western imperial interests crashed upon Qing shores, highlighted by the Opium Wars and a century of humiliating concessions. Although Hango Xiun could not have named the opium trade or British warships, his verses in their poetic yet pointed way indicated a cyclical unraveling. By placing Qianlong's era as the apex from which a precipitous descent would follow, the prophecy captured the essence of cyclical flourish and decay, a recurring motif in Chinese historiography. From the vantage point of the 21st century, one can trace these forecasts like stepping stones laid out centuries before, bridging the illusions of invulnerability with the harsh truth that history is never static. It ebbs and flows in patterns, just as Hango Xiun suggested, always moving forward yet never losing the echoes of its past, unraveling the veil of dynastic transformations. If the Qianlong era embodied the apex of Qing splendor, the ensuing epochs captured its gradual descent into crisis, thus revealing the depths of Hango Xiun's foresight. After Qianlong's abdication, Emperor Jia Qing assumed the throne in 1796, a year symbolically represented by the red dragon in the Chinese cyclical calendar. In Hango Xiun's fifth poem, reference to a heavy red dragon is interpreted by many as an allusion to that very year, seemingly presaging the tribulations that would culminate in the empire's eventual unraveling. Though Jia Qing's rule extended until 1820, he never fully reversed the entrenched corruption of Qianlong's later years. The seeds planted during He Shen's brazen era of graft continued to flourish, corroding the imperial administration from within. Under Jia Qing, one of the most vexing challenges arose in the form of the White Lotus Rebellion, an uprising propelled by a blend of folk religious fervor, peasant desperation, and resentment toward the tax burdens inflicted by corrupt officials. Spreading across multiple provinces, this rebellion lasted nearly a decade, draining the Qing treasury and spotlighting the empire's waning capacity to address internal disorder. The crisis underscored the precarious foundation upon which Qing authority now rested, a foundation that once seemed unshakable under Kangxi and Qianlong, but was in fact profoundly fragile. Even though the government ultimately subdued the White Lotus insurgents, the victory proved more Pyrrhic than triumphant. Weakened financially and administratively, the Qing dynasty emerged from the conflict less cohesive and far more vulnerable to future external threats. Parallel to these internal struggles, tectonic shifts in global power dynamics were unfolding. Europe, spurred on by the Industrial Revolution, began casting its gaze ever more covetously on Qing China, rich in both resources and potential consumers. In seeking to break through China's trade barriers, British merchants and politicians devised a scheme that would shape global geopolitics for decades: the illegal opium trade. By importing this potent and addictive substance into Chinese ports, Britain sowed widespread addiction, draining silver from the Chinese economy and fracturing local communities. Alarmed at the social decay wrought by this influx, Emperor Daoguang ordered definitive measures to curb the trade. The most well-known of these efforts was carried out by Commissioner Lin Zexu, whose public destruction of opium in 1839 famously ignited the First Opium War. Across his cryptic verses, Hango Xiun had not named the British Empire or the destructive potential of opium. Yet the sweeping references to falling from within and foreign tides rising appear in hindsight to mirror these historic junctures closely. After Daoguang's unsuccessful confrontation with the British, the Treaty of Nanking in 1842 inflicted humiliating terms on China. Observers at the time might not have drawn a straight line from these events back to an obscure Tang Dynasty Zen master, but with modern scholarship, the parallels are difficult to dismiss. Indeed, many of Hango Xiun's lines seem less like poetic musing and more like an echo carried across centuries, foreshadowing the interconnected fates of rulers, rebels, and distant powers alike. The notion that Hango Xiun's poems were intended solely for Chinese dynastic events is complicated by the 13th and 14th verses. These final two, the only ones yet to be definitively fulfilled, expand the scope of prophecy beyond regional wars and imperial transitions. Rather than discussing which emperor would rise or which dynasty would collapse, these verses speak directly to humankind as a collective and unusual pivot from the poems that center primarily on China's historical narrative. While some might argue that these references still apply primarily to China's internal affairs, a growing school of interpreters sees them as global admonitions, especially given the repeated appearance of the year 2025. The 13th poem in particular alludes to a momentous shift tied to the Western world, with cryptic phrases suggesting a force rising from the South. With the advantage of hindsight, many have linked the year of the rat to 2020, the year when a global pandemic rewrote daily life in virtually every corner of the planet. The alignment is too compelling for most to ignore, especially considering that the word plague or great sickness appears in translations of the original Chinese text. Whether Hango Xiun foresaw a literal outbreak like COVID-19 or was using the concept of pestilence as a symbolic reference is a topic of lively debate among historians, sinologists, and even esoteric scholars. Nonetheless, the correspondence between prophecy and reality, though open to interpretation, invites a sense of eerie wonder and apprehension. Following that mention of the year of the rat, the poem continues with a line about the West, witnessing a rising power from the South. While the prophecy remains nebulous about specifics, it has triggered myriad theories. Some see a literal political ascendance of countries in the Southern Hemisphere. Others perceive it as a metaphorical shift where marginalized voices gain unprecedented influence in Western societies. Certain interpreters even connected to a spiritual revival or ecological movement emerging from previously underrepresented regions. The lines in Hango Xiun's verse do not clarify whether the South refers to a direction relative to Europe, North America, or even China itself. This ambiguity has fueled countless analyses, each offering different and sometimes conflicting predictions of what might transpire. What resonates most strongly with modern readers, however, is the poem's culminating line. By the year of the snake, all shall return to the center. The year of the snake next falls in 2025, and many commentators link the concept of center to the historical self-designation of China as the Middle Kingdom. Others interpret center as a universal axis around which humanity's future will turn a call to unity or perhaps a foreshadowing of conflict. Some voices more pessimistic in tone warn that the prophecy may portend a catastrophic event, a major war or global crisis that forces nations into alignment or confrontation. This variety of perspectives underscores the depth and complexity of Hango Xiun's words. While the final truth will be revealed only through the passage of time, the predictions undeniably stir a sense of anticipation and even dread regarding what 2025 might hold. To comprehend the weight these prophecies carry in the collective consciousness, it helps to recall that Hango Xiun is hardly the sole visionary, singling out 2025 as a pivotal year. In Western traditions, Nostradamus has garnered tremendous attention for centuries, with interpreters scouring his quatrains for references to world-altering events. Various other mystics, mediums, and secular analysts, ranging from historical spiritual seers in Eastern Europe to modern-day trend forecasters, have also converged on this decade as a period of profound realignment. It might be coincidental. It might be reflective of cyclical anxieties that re-emerge each time a new generation grapples with global uncertainties. Yet, from a historical standpoint, it is undeniably rare to see multiple disparate prophetic streams converging on a single timeline. In theological discussions, such convergences often prompt reflection on humankind's role as co-creators of destiny. If multiple prophecies point to a climactic moment, do they shape or merely reflect our collective actions? Religious philosophies often propose that destiny is not fixed. Instead, it unfolds in synergy with human free will. Zen Buddhism in particular emphasizes the concept of mindfulness in the present moment, arguing that focusing on the here and now can alter the streams of karma that determine future outcomes. Thus, if Hango Xiun indeed perceived a looming crisis or transformation in 2025, it does not necessarily mean catastrophe is sealed in stone. On the contrary, it serves as a clarion call for heightened awareness, urging leaders, communities, and individuals to examine the moral and ethical dimensions of their choices. Simultaneously, historians caution against taking any prophecy at face value. They remind us that the texts we read today have passed through centuries of reinterpretations, translation, and potential embellishment. The 14 poems attributed to Hango Xiun might themselves have undergone editorial changes, whether in the Song dynasty, the Yuan dynasty, or the subsequent periods when scribes and monks copied ancient manuscripts by hand. Even so, the references to Ming-Qing and later events that align uncannily well with real history cannot be dismissed as mere coincidences. The lines describing the swirl of chaos at the end of the Ming, the ascendancy of the Qing under a child emperor who arrests his regent in the 60-year apex of Qianlong's era, are all too specific to be easily explained away. Amid this interplay of skepticism and fascination, the 13th poem emerges as a riveting focal point. If its allusions to the pandemic in 2020 are valid, the next question inevitably becomes, what about the second half of that prophecy? Whether it foretells a decisive shift in global power structures or a wave of spiritual awakening remains to be seen. For believers, these verses serve as a cautionary note. Ignoring or ridiculing them could be akin to disregarding an early warning system. For skeptics, they stand as artifacts of cultural mythology, a testament to humanity's enduring desire to find pattern and meaning in the chaos of existence. Stepping back from the swirl of speculation, we discover an underlying philosophical core to Hango Xiun's works. While much attention has been given to the verifiable details predicting emperors' wars and societal upheavals, the monk's deeper message concerns the impermanence and interdependence that define life. In Buddhism, the concepts of impermanence, anicca and dependent origination, pratitya samutpada, underscore that no phenomenon arises independently of causes and conditions, nor does any entity endure forever. Hango Xiun's poems, albeit focusing on worldly events, echo this universal truth. Dynasties collapse, emperors die, societies shift, and even the grandest civilizations are but moments in the cosmic timeline. This perspective invites a broadened view of prophecy. Rather than seeing the verses solely as predictions, one might interpret them as meditative reflections intended to provoke wisdom and humility among their readers. The repeated motif of cyclical rise and fall across dynasties serves as a reminder that wealth, power, and even cultural identity are transient. When he wrote about the downfall of the Ming or the ascendancy of Kangxi, he was not simply chronicling future events. He was stressing the fragility of human constructs. By extension, the references to 2025 could function less as a fixed forecast and more as a catalyst for moral and spiritual introspection, warning us that once again history's wheel is turning and our collective choices will determine whether we usher in harmony or devastation. This philosophical reading aligns with Zen traditions that often approach prophecy or revelation as tools for awakening the mind. A Zen master might use a shout or a riddle koan to jar a student into deeper insight. Hango Xiun's poems, dense with imagery and veiled in metaphor, may serve a similar function on a grander scale to jolt entire generations into recognizing the precariousness of their pursuits. When applied to our present circumstances, overshadowed by environmental crises, geopolitical tensions, and technological upheavals, the poems deliver a potent warning. We stand at a threshold of possibility. Our actions may either reaffirm the cycles of conflict and imbalance or lead to new pathways of cooperation and sustainability. Among Western audiences, interest in Hango Xiun's prophecies has surged in recent years, partly thanks to online platforms that magnify sensationalist interpretations. Yet amid this clamor, serious scholars of Chinese history and comparative religion caution against simplifications. Hango Xiun was not a fortune teller hawking easy answers for fame. He was by most accounts a dedicated monk who believed in the transformative power of spiritual discipline and moral living. His decision to reference future events was less a quest for renown than a manifestation of compassion a desire to offer guidance to souls who might otherwise be lost in the illusions of permanence and self-importance. Thus, when we consider the 2025 prophecy, it becomes a mirror reflecting back our own collective anxieties, aspirations, and responsibilities. Whether it heralds a cataclysm or a renaissance, the heart of Hango Xiun's message remains. Look beyond the immediate to glimpse the grander scheme and remember that every outcome hinges on the seeds we plant today. Toward the uncharted horizon of 2025, as discussions surrounding the 2025 prophecy intensify, one of the most intriguing lines remains Hango Xiun's cryptic statement, "By the year of the snake, all shall return to the center." In Chinese culture, the phrase "return to the center" resonates deeply, given that the name China Zhongguo literally translates to Middle Kingdom. Historically, this concept shaped the Chinese worldview, suggesting that China occupied the central axis of civilization, with everything else unfolding at its periphery. Could Hango Xiun's phrase imply the country's renewed prominence on the global stage? Economic data from the last several decades indicates China's remarkable growth, rising to become one of the world's leading economies. On the geopolitical front, alliances, trade networks, and international initiatives like the Belt and Road suggest a shifting balance that many interpret as a pivot back toward an Asia-centric global order. Yet to interpret the prophecy merely as political commentary would be to overlook the poem's deeper spiritual or psychological dimensions. Another possible reading is that the center references not just a nation, but an inner spiritual axis, the middle way taught in Buddhism. It could be a universal call for human civilization to rediscover balance and equilibrium in an era riddled with polarized politics, cultural fragmentation, and ecological crises. From climate change to moral erosion, the challenges facing humanity are vast and interconnected, necessitating a shift in consciousness that returns our collective focus to compassion, moderation, and unity. In this sense, all shall return to the center might speak of a global pivot towards sustainable values, albeit triggered by turmoil that makes such a shift unavoidable. Critics of these interpretations argue that such broad statements can be retrofitted to suit any historical turning point. After all, human history is dotted with countless pivotal years and prophecies. Yet the specificity of 2025, coupled with echoes from other oracles, invests Hango Xiun's words with a potent allure. At a practical level, new technologies, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and biotechnology are poised to reshape industries, societies, and ethical frameworks. The possibility of rapid climate change or conflict over resources compounds the urgency. The sense that humanity stands at a crossroads becomes palpable when we look at trends in population movements, political alliances, and global health. In short, the stage is indeed set for a significant shift within this decade. Outside of China, we see transformations as well. Countries in the global south, India, Brazil, Nigeria, Indonesia, and others show economic and demographic surges that may tilt the axis of influence. With these shifts come calls for new power structures that break from Eurocentric or US-centric paradigms. Could this be the force rising from the south that Hango Xiun referenced? If so, the redefinition of global hierarchies could be both disruptive and transformative, weaving new alliances and possibly dissolving old ones. Whether this future takes a constructive shape, promoting equitable development and cultural exchange, or devolves into rivalry and conflict may hinge on the same principle that governed all of Hango Xiun's versus humankind's capacity for wisdom and unity in the face of inevitable change. An equally compelling dimension to the prophecy is its moral imperative. Just as Hango Xiun slapped Emperor Xuanzong to awaken him to compassion, one might interpret the references to 2025 as a slap to modern society, an abrupt signal that invites us to reevaluate our values, priorities, and the fragile bonds that hold the global community together. One of the consistent themes across Zen teachings is that realization often comes through shock or paradox. In Zen practice, a master may provide a puzzling koan or unexpected gesture precisely to break through the student's habitual thought patterns. On a civilizational scale, catastrophic events, wars, pandemics, climate disasters can serve a similar function, jolting entire populations to reconsider their paths. If the year 2025 is indeed set to be such a moment, the question becomes whether we can glean transformative lessons before devastation forces them upon us. Yet, it would be simplistic to see the prophecy as a doomsday scenario. While some interpret 2025 as a harbinger of global conflict, particularly referencing other visions that hint at a third world war, others read it as a threshold of renewal. The prophecy's line about rising from the south could symbolize a blossoming of collaboration and innovation in regions traditionally sidelined in world affairs. Perhaps new voices and ideas will offer creative solutions to long-standing dilemmas like poverty, inequality, and environmental decay. In the best-case scenario, these transformations would mark not an apocalypse, but a renaissance of global consciousness leading to more inclusive and empathetic political systems. Of course, prophecy alone does not enact change. Real-world shifts hinge upon policy choices, cultural evolution, and personal commitments. If Hango Xiun saw 2025 as a pivotal juncture, he likely understood that such a moment would only manifest through the accumulation of countless human decisions. Every investment in education, every grassroots campaign for social justice, every diplomatic negotiation that diffuses tension rather than inflaming it, these are the building blocks of a future that might align with a hopeful reading of the prophecy. Conversely, ignoring the lessons of history and persisting in short-term self-serving strategies invites the darker interpretations to take root. One particularly striking aspect of Hango Xiun's final poem is the idea that ultimate meaning resides in the actions of those who come after. The poem suggests that while prophecy can guide and caution, it never absolves anyone of responsibility. This emphasis on intergenerational continuity resonates powerfully today, as younger activists demand accountability from political and corporate leaders on climate change, socio-economic justice, and the ethical use of technology. In many ways, the burden and the privilege of shaping the 2025 scenario belongs to those who recognize its significance. While we cannot confirm with certainty what Hango Xiun precisely foresaw, we can glean from his teachings that embracing moral clarity, humility, and collective well-being could be our best course of action as we edge closer to the date inscribed in his timeless verse. Reflecting on Hango Xiun's legacy, we see an intricate tapestry that weaves together the intangible threads of faith, history, and philosophy. In the West, prophecy tends to be viewed through the lens of biblical or Judeo-Christian tradition, where apocalyptic imagery and final judgments are recurring motifs. By contrast, Hango Xiun's predictions rooted in the Zen Buddhist tradition carry an understated, almost poetic solemnity. They are not couched in grandiose threats of eternal damnation. Rather, they hint at cycles of ascendance and decline, cautioning that these cycles revolve around humanity's collective virtues and follies. In this respect, the repeated motif of forewarning functions akin to a Buddhist parable. Readers are drawn into historical events: the fall of the Ming, the consolidation of the Qing, the ephemeral splendor of Qianlong's court, and the humiliations that followed, only to realize each episode reflects fundamental truths about impermanence and moral responsibility. If a civilization loses sight of compassion and justice, it inevitably sows the seeds of its own undoing. And so the poem that speaks of 2025 implicitly reminds us, if we remain negligent, the patterns of history will repeat themselves. But if we awaken, a new chapter might unfold. Here lies the dual nature of prophecy. It can be read fatalistically as an unchangeable decree, or embraced as a prompt urging humanity to rise above complacency. For instance, after the devastation of the First Opium War, some scholars pointed out parallels in Hango Xiun's text, hoping that acknowledging the prophecy might spark political and social reforms. Yet actual reforms in 19th century China faltered, overshadowed by internal strife and the slow grip of foreign imperialism. This cyclical pattern of half-hearted reform, corruption, and strife recurred until the eventual collapse of the Qing in the early 20th century. From a Buddhist standpoint, one might say the karmic momentum set in motion by greed, ignorance, and arrogance persisted until it consumed the entire imperial system. In the modern era, the global scale of challenges demands a broader perspective. Hango Xiun's poems no longer speak to one empire alone. They speak to a planet where boundaries are increasingly permeable. Economic shifts in one region reverberate worldwide. A virus in one city can, as we saw in 2020, shut down entire continents. Ecological crises ignore national lines. Zen philosophy, which emphasizes interdependence, underscores that the well-being of one nation is intricately linked to that of all others. The final poem's spotlight on a global transformation thus resonates with contemporary realities, where the notion of all returning to the center might equally apply to forging an international unity or confronting a shared catastrophe. Whether one believes fervently in Hango Xiun's vision, remains skeptical, or finds inspiration in its allegorical wisdom, the challenge remains. How shall we respond? Historians and philosophers remind us that prophecy is not destiny, but an invitation to mindfulness. If an ancient Zen master could articulate the cyclical nature of rise and fall so clearly, perhaps the real prophecy lies in our power to break the cycle by tempering ambition with compassion, knowledge with humility, and power with responsibility. In drawing these reflections to a close, we return to the final lines of Hango Xiun's narrative, where he insists that the ultimate question, what comes next, must be posed to those living in and beyond the appointed times. His cryptic reference to the year 2025 is not a punctuation mark ending history's sentence. It is more like an ellipsis, suggesting the story continues and that we, the protagonists of this modern chapter, bear the onus of authorship. The growing interest in these prophecies, from casual curiosity to rigorous academic analysis, reveals how deeply they resonate with our shared sense of uncertainty. On some level, many people sense that the world stands at a crossroads, whether it be technological, environmental, social, or spiritual. And what if the year passes without upheaval or dramatic realization? Prophecies have been proven wrong many times, and societies have weathered apocalyptic predictions that never materialized. Should we breathe a collective sigh of relief and shelve Hango Xiun's poems as another historical curiosity? Or should we accept that even a missed prophecy can serve as a preventative measure, a warning that galvanized us into positive action, ensuring that the predicted catastrophe never came to pass? In either scenario, the dialogues and introspection spurred by these verses remain a boon to collective consciousness. Far from trivial, the very act of reflecting on the delicate balance of our civilization can foster new commitments to empathy, justice, and sustainability. As we stand in the midst of transformations unprecedented in scope, automation reshaping economies, artificial intelligence challenging notions of human labor, climate instability threatening entire ecosystems, Hango Xiun's age-old reminder of impermanence resonates like a bell in a silent temple. His poems counsel that hubris precedes decline and humility precedes renewal. If an empire as vast as the Ming or as sophisticated as the Qing can crumble, modern nations and power blocks are hardly immune. With technological wonders at our fingertips, we may be more connected than any generation in history, but we are also uniquely vulnerable to global crises, whether viral, digital, or ecological. The real test of 2025, or any symbolic year, may lie not in external cataclysms, but in whether we collectively choose a path of mindful evolution. Hence, we might interpret Hango Xiun's final admonition as an invitation to each of us, urging our active participation in shaping a future that transcends the cyclical tragedies he once recorded in his scrolls. By forging policies that champion equitable prosperity, by fostering dialogue between conflicting ideologies, by investing in holistic education that weds reason to compassion, and by remembering that our shared humanity is both fragile and precious, we can tip the balance of prophecy toward a brighter horizon. As you finish reading these reflections, contemplate the weight of your own role. Should the wheel of fate indeed pivot in 2025, let it not pivot on the axis of fear or destruction, but on the promise of renewal. That perhaps is the truest lesson from a Zen master who saw beyond his own epoch that in the final analysis, we alone become the architects of whatever prophecy unfolds.